Paul, what does that say about housing policy over the last decade in this country?
Housing policy is working really, really well in this country for those it's designed to work for, which is big property developers and big corporate landlords. And it's time to dispense with the pretense that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and now the Lowry wing of the government are working really hard to address the housing crisis, but are just failing utterly abysmally. And so we went from 5,000 homeless in 2016, 10,000, we're now at over 15,000, and instead recognise that this is a deliberate policy choice. They are choosing for 4,600 children to go to bed tonight in hotel rooms or in other forms of emergency accommodation. Policy is designed...
For two Irish property developers? There really is only two Irish big property developers.
And they're making profits. One of them is making about 50,000 euros per house they build. The other's making about 70,000 euros per house. But
is it really your thesis that all of this is by design to boost the profits of two Irish property developers?
And the corporate landlords who are making record profits, all on the basis that these people, I think some of these people genuinely believe, and this is why they have so many incentives for private developers and corporate landlords. They're basically able to pay no tax in terms of the corporate landlords. The private developers have Croí Cónaithe, they have waiver of development levies, waiver of Uisce Éireann. The idea is if we incentivise these people enough, if we give them enough profits, if we keep prices high enough, and let's say that the Help to Buy scheme was explicitly introduced after the CIF, the Construction Industry Federation, lobbied for it in order to keep prices high. So the government said, yes, we'll do that, let's keep prices high. Eventually, the theory is some of these houses will trickle down to ordinary people. But actually what is happening is that these people are getting richer and richer at the top and the housing crisis is getting worse. And I actually think the government is kind of stopping even pretending. Like 10 years ago, we had a promise that by the middle of 2016, we'd have no more long-term homelessness. Then we had Simon Coveney say by the end of 2016, we would have no one living in hotel rooms. And since then, homeless figures have actually tripled. Rents have doubled. House prices have almost doubled at this stage. So it's time to recognise that the housing policy is working as it's designed to. The Friends of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are getting...
Is it working as designed?
I actually don't believe that even Paul believes that. I'm being quite truthful. That is a complete guff. I mean, the idea that, a government would bring forward policies to diminish the capacity of the state to provide housing for its citizens is beyond laughable. But what we have is a significant challenge around the issue of capacity, with capacity constraints across the entirety. Labour capacity, skill shortages, infrastructure deficiencies in terms of wastewater and water. I was in Wexford yesterday, met with people that were highlighting, the chambers were highlighting the fact that they can't build houses in some parts of Wexford because of a scarcity of water infrastructure. So we have significant capacity constraints across the entirety. There's ambitious plans, but we're not meeting them. And the first area that we have to address is the whole issue of planning and permitting. We also have to accept that we just don't have the financial wherewithal in terms of the people that Paul talks about, making all these billions. They're funding these houses at 10 and 12%, which eventually falls on the person who's buying the house. So we've, across the entirety, we have major issues. And government is bringing forward proposals again around making sure that they streamline the various agencies that are responsible for delivery of infrastructure and housing to ensure we unlock and untap every avenue that the state has available to it. But until such times we address the planning, the permitting and the finance, whether Paul likes it or not, the issue is that
What's the issue with planning? Because, I mean, the last government heralded the planning legislation. I mean, it's your
yes,
colleague, Darragh O'Brien, trumpeted it. This was going to solve our planning problems. I mean, the ink wasn't dry and we were told planning is a huge issue and we've got to reform.
Yeah, well, that bill has just passed and I think there'll be a period of time before it beds in and you can be sure there'll be people heading off to the courts challenging it. But, I mean, we simply have a situation where, nobody knows the end date for planning. So an application is made to a local authority. It can take for a very long period of time, sometimes years.
But will that legislation solve that problem?
I think there's still deficiencies in it because I don't think that the timelines are arbitrarily enough to oblige the local authorities and Bord Pleanála.
Was it not a little silly to spend so much political capital passing a piece of legislation that, as I say, before the ink is even dry, we're saying that there's actually shortcomings in this?
Well, I always believed there were shortcomings because I just don't think the arbitrary timelines were enough to ensure that local authorities on Bord Pleanála and in the event of judicial reviews, that only those that are completely involved in the process can take a judicial review. We have a situation where citizens anywhere can take judicial reviews, and they do that. But the point is, one area that we haven't looked at is we just do not use the public good as the matrix for objections, for planning permissions, because we've always sided with the individuals, the community groups that make the objections. But at this stage, we have to accept that citizens have an entitlement to a house, and having 14,000 people homeless in Ireland is a direct consequence of the fact that we can't build enough homes, and sometimes that's because we object to them ourselves as well.
Danny, there was a sense in the early days of this government, not long after we had a programme for government finalised and Micheál Martin was elected Taoiseach, that there was, maybe chaos is overstating it, but they realised that the numbers they were relying on house completions for 2024 were inaccurate, numbers that had been trumpeted during the campaign. Rent pressure zones were on the table. No sooner were they on the table, they were off the table. Tax breaks for developers were back on the table. They were very quickly taken off the table, not often by the same minister, different parties with different positions around the cabinet table. What it all gave a sense of was that there was a degree of panic around cabinet, that maybe Housing for All isn't the plan and it's not working. What's the mood music today?
Well, you certainly had, at the time, a lack of alignment between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. You definitely had a divergence of opinion, to say the very least, in relation to housing policy, in terms of rent pressure zones, and in terms of tax breaks for developers. I mean, literally, as you said, we had ministers coming out on one day saying Section 23 type. I think we led with it in the Business Post, only to be kind of poo-pooed within 24 hours by a minister from another party. I think at the moment, the general sense is, one, that if it's going to be changed on the watch of this government, then it's going to need more than just the Department of Housing to take ownership of it, and therefore it's going to take the Department of Taoiseach to essentially drive this. And whether or not the appetite to do that politically is there remains to be seen. Obviously, we've heard talk of a housing czar, and Brendan McDonagh's name has been mentioned and all the rest of it. But you're kind of thinking, will that not just only complicate the issue? Surely you have a housing minister to do this. And well, what we haven't heard, it's now 11 years since Alan Kelly, the then Minister for Housing, declared an emergency. 11 years. And nothing has, or like very little has happened. We don't see any emergency powers being applied. We don't see kind of CPOs, which I think should have happened. We see vacant units, particularly in Dublin City Centre. You see vacant units, lying idle ad nauseum without being moved on, and that's a council issue. But it's a more fundamental issue. But also as well, you have a failure from within the political system to recognise that we can't just keep objecting to major housing projects because they're in your backyard. And we have politicians from all hues talking one message or speaking one message at national level, saying, it's a disgrace, we have, a crisis, we have all of this. And the members of their own party at local level objecting. That cannot continue if we are ever going to get out of this situation. I live in Glasnevin, close to Dublin City Centre. We are literally, we are chock-a-block. And we see more and more apartment blocks coming up all the time. But again, you see the NIMBYism kind of kicking in all the time.
Well, the old industrial estate in Glasnevin is going to be cleared. It's going to be effectively a new town. And already people are saying, actually, no, we don't want that. Or we certainly don't want it as high as planned.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that the very people who are, as I said, the very sort of parties that are complaining at national level in the Dáil day after day about the lack of action in relation to housing are the very groups and parties who tend to be objecting at local level, because we did our own exercise and we saw the frequency with which parties, particularly opposition parties, and there are some members of the government parties as well, objecting to major planning. It's a disgrace and it shouldn't happen. And yet at the same time, we have politicians talking out of both sides of their mouth.
Paul, is a system of objections slowing things down?
This is a red herring.
It's not a red herring,
It is a red herring. The question here is a fundamental failure of the market. There are tens of thousands of unactivated planning permissions that private developers are sitting on because they think they'll make more profit later down the line. And the state allows it to happen. It refuses to use powers of CPO. There's derelict sites. There's 50,000 vacant units in this country that have been vacant for 6 years or more. And I agree with you 100% on that one. the state should be intervening, should be compulsorily purchasing those, and say society says we're not going to allow these homes to sit empty during a housing crisis while there's people growing up in hotel rooms. We're going to buy them. We're going to buy them at a market rate, but we're going to buy them and put them to use. But you have really a market fundamentalism by the government. So we've been on this track for 10 years, more, 12 years, like you're saying, a recognition of a housing emergency. The government has gone deeper and deeper and deeper into trying to incentivise the private sector. So we got rid of...
The government over that time as well has spent more and more and more public money. Per capita, we spend more public money than almost any other member state in Europe.
And how do we spend a large portion of that money in subsidising private landlords? We hand over €1 billion a year to private landlords. We have a crazy situation. That's just in terms of HAP, for example. You have a crazy situation where councils...
But also in terms of the delivery of new houses. About 6 billion of the 20 to 25 odd billion that we need to spend is state money. It's public money, which is much higher than most places in Europe.
Yes, and being pumped through private...
We're a socialist housing ideal.
But the government refuses. I mean, if you look at the Housing Commission report, right? The government commissioned this report to say, let's get to the bottom of this. And what did the Housing Commission say? They said we need a radical reset in terms of housing, and they say we need to base housing policy on an assessment of housing needed for a functioning society. This should not be conflated with market demand or construction sector capacity. And that is not being done because instead it's all based on how we can work this through the market. The answer is to reject the market model. We need to have a state construction company and to say, as a society, we're going to prioritise...
The largest actor in the housing market at the moment is the state, both in terms of provision of funding to build homes and on the other side then renting homes and supporting people in rent.
Exactly. So we're paying money to private landlords.
But the government is involved in both sides of that in terms of the incentivisation of building and also in terms of the rental market.
But why instead don't we build homes? Why don't we build homes and rent them to people? And that way the state has an asset, we provide public housing.
You're saying the government is doing nothing other than
throwing money at
the market will deliver. The market is not delivering, so the government is intervening to try and ensure we can stimulate demand and supply.
The government is intervening to give more money to private developers and landlords. It confirms my essential first point that this is the purpose.
But all you say
policy.
with the state construction company, if you were to set one up, has all the same cost inputs that a private developer would have.
Not the profit. The 50,000
that's
or
the only
70,000, and there's
but
other layers of profit.
That's the only saving you make, is that profit.
But it's not only the 50,000 or the 70,000. There's other layers of profit made by others within the process of making the house that go on top of that. So we end up with a saving of maybe 70 or 90,000.
Which, sorry,
that's very, very
but
substantial.
you're talking about kind of building providers and suppliers. You're not talking about setting up a state building providing company or a state hardware store company, are you?
No, absolutely. But there's layers of subcontractors that could be done away with by a state construction company employing workers on good wages and conditions. But if we could bring housing prices down...
subcontractors in the construction industry, all effectively public servants as well. Is that what you're talking
employed.
about?
Let's employ people to build homes.
We're trying to address an issue, not create a monster that simply will not work. The idea that you'd have a state construction company...
As we used to... Councils used to build homes.
But that's different to a state construction company, as you're proposing. I've heard that before. I've looked at this. Look, the issue of housing is a challenge all across Northern Europe. In fact, across the entire European Union. There's a committee has been established in the Parliament just to look at it. But
are the rest of them failing as badly as we are?
They're in deep trouble. Yes, in deep trouble. The Swedens of this world, the Denmarks, the Germanys, the Netherlands. No, they have different models. They have different models. The Swedish model was a very different model to the Irish model. It is in deep trouble as well. It is a significant problem. And some of the reasons are the constraints on the capacity side in terms of zoning of land, the funding then for infrastructure, water, roads, sewers, etc. And, of course, let's be under no illusions, objections. Right across, the Netherlands has almost given up trying to build homes because of the level of objections.
Danny, is there political appetite for radical reform of how we deliver housing? Or is it kind of a housing for all, but maybe tweaked here and there?
I think any of the suggestions that I tended to see, other than Paul's rather bonkers suggestion, if you forgive me,
except the neoliberal framework that everything has to be done by the market, then it's bonkers. But not if you say that housing needs should come before profits of private developers.
Show me a state company anywhere in the world at that level or scale that can provide something at more efficiency, at lower cost than the private market. And let me park that point. To the one fundamental point, and Billy's raised it, is water charges, right? And water and the whole issue of costs. We are now seeing Irish Water intervening and saying we can no longer support this scheme because of the lack of capacity. There was a political decision in 2016 to axe domestic water charges, a populist decision by Fianna Fáil, which never should have happened. Cheer-led by Paul and his others, that fundamentally changed the dynamic. That has set back the cause of housing delivery and of the infrastructure in this country. And it should never have happened. And all parties who went along with it should be ashamed
you're the
of themselves.
tail wagging the dog of housing failure.
How you can blame the defeat of the water charges for the housing crisis? I really don't.
I said it's one issue. It's
Sure,
one issue.
But I think one thing that's worth looking at, and it's been raised by experts in the area, is the issue of data centres, which we'll probably get onto, is that data centres are consuming an increasing proportion of our water. That is water that is then not being allocated to homes that need access to water. That's a strategic decision that needs to be made. Are we going to prioritise homes, or are we going to prioritise data centres? The same goes in terms of the building workers involved in these. And that's the benefit of saying we reject the market, which is directing resources based on profit, and instead, as a society, we say we're going to direct the resource to building affordable homes.
No to data centres, though, is it?
No more data centres, absolutely.
All right, and what about the Intels and the Microsofts and the Googles and all of those that are paying large amounts of wages, corporate tax to the exchequer? You're saying no to all of them. Get rid of them.
Do you know how data centres work?
I'll tell you. We'll very quickly resolve the housing crisis if Paul was in charge.
We spend 10 times the amount of our electricity on data centres than the average European country. They're 4% of our carbon emissions.
They're a strategically important component in ensuring that we retain the tech sector in Ireland.
30% electricity, is that okay?
They're a strategic sector. They're a strategic sector.
Would 40% be okay?
And if you look at
50%
and if you look at the data centres, Paul, if you look at the data centres, in fact, they will become a part of the solutions in terms of backfeeding to the grid when it's necessary. So they will be a component in ensuring
they're part of
that
the problem. How many jobs are in data centres, Billy?
Because they support the entirety of the tech sector.
How many jobs?
And you don't have to ask Billy Keller, talk to the IDA, talk to all the others, talk to the Intels,
how many jobs
talk
are
to the
in data
Microsofts,
centres,
talk to the Googles,
how many
talk
jobs?
to them all.
How many jobs?
Tens of thousands.
No,
when you take the entirety.
Oh, yes.
When you take the entirety.
But let's not take the entirety. Let's take data centres.
You can't.
How many jobs?
Just separate it out.
You just answer the question.
You can't
how many
separate
jobs are in data centres? Am I correct in saying it's probably about 3,000 jobs in data centres?
Separate out
and they're going to use 30% of our electricity by 2030.
We are going to talk about data centres, I'm sure, in the context of climate plans. Lots of people getting in touch, as you'd imagine. A state construction company would end up being a collection of wasters. The state does nothing efficiently. Just look at the bike shed. As a HAP tenant, says somebody else.
And the bike shed was built by a private contractor, Sensora, a politically connected private contractor. And that's the point. Who built the children's hospital? Commissioned by a state agency. But that's the point. But that's the model we don't agree with. We want a state construction. Instead of, it's a private company that's building the children's hospital. It's not the state. All this inefficiency that's happening is because of massive profiteering. Who built the OPW wall? It wasn't the state. A private company was contracted.
You think the OPW would be much more efficient if they hired builders themselves, directly paid them and got that wall built?
Yes. Yes, I do. Rather than a private
triumph
company,
of hope over experience. As a HAP tenant, I fundamentally believe HAP is a poison chalice, says somebody else watching at home. Just like the Help to Buy, the HAP props up unsustainable rent prices. Let this Celtic Tiger 2.0 die a natural death. However painful it will be, it needs to happen. The housing market is not natural. The view of somebody at home.